Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah nahmaduhu wa nasta'inuhu wa nastaghfiruhu wa nastahdihi wa na'udhu billahi min shururi anfusina wa min sayyiati a'malina man yahdihillahu fala mudilla lahu wa man yudlil fala hadiya lahu wa ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lahu wa ashhadu anna sayyidana wa nabiyyana wa habibana wa sanadana wa Moulana Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu amma ba'd. قال الله تعالى في القرآن المجيد والفرقان الحميد قد أفلح من زكاها وقد خاب من دساها وقال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم ألا إن في الجسد لمضغة إذا صلحت صلح الجسد كله وإذا فسدت فسد الجسد كله ألا وهي القلب. Respected listeners, after praising Allah Almighty and sending the choicest of salutations upon the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the verse of the Quran that I've just recited in front of you is part of Surah Shams, in which Allah Almighty, He takes oath and He swears on 7 things. He takes an oath on the sun and the moon, the day and the night, وَالشَّمْسِ وَضُحَاهَا وَالْقَمَرِ إِذَا تَلَاهَا وَالنَّهَارِ وَإِذَا جَلَّاهَا وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا يَغْشَاهَا وَالسَّمَاءِ وَمَا بَنَاهَا, the heavens and the earth, and then upon the soul itself and the person. And then He says, قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا. Allah Almighty says that the person who purifies the self, then he has achieved complete success in this world and the hereafter. وَقَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَّاهَا. And that the person who's polluted the self and he's allowed the negative traits, hasad, kina, bughs, all of these things to enter the heart, قَدْ خَابَ, then he's gone to loss. Nabi Kareem sallallahu alayhi wa sallam in another hadith, he mentions, Allah inna fil jasadi la mudgha, that be attentive, listen carefully, pay attention. Indeed, inside the body is a piece of flesh. إِذَا fasadat, when it's corrupted, then the entire body is corrupted. And when it is corrected, then the entire body is corrected. Allah wa hiya al-qalb. Be attentive, this is the heart itself. In this ayat of the Quran and this hadith, the topic is all about purification of the self, purification of the inner self. And you find this topic throughout the Quran and hadith in different ways mentioned, to an extent that the ulama have written, many of the ulama have written, that the purification of the inner self is actually a wajib, it's compulsory on every single individual. And as part of this, the ulama have written what are the negative traits that a person has, what are the negative traits that could destroy a person, lead him to the way to Jahannam and take him away from the path of Jannat. So inshallah, many ulama have written on this topic, but there's one particular alim, one particular sheikh from the 11th century, Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi, who's gone into this, he's delved into this, and he was an absolute genius because he was a master of many sciences, philosophy, he was a master of logic, the master of the traditional sciences. So he took his learning and he applied it into this self-reformation, into this whole concept of correcting individuals, and he wrote a fantastic book on this, Ihya al-Muddin, the revival of the Islamic sciences. So inshallah today we'll be doing a bit of an introduction, but over the next 10 weeks we'll be going over one particular chapter, one particular section of a book that he's done called Ihya al-Muddin, but it's been then abridged into another book called Al-Arba'in. But inshallah we'll talk about that. But before we go into all of these topics, the idea today is to set the scene and to explain exactly what's going to take place over the next 11 weeks, inshallah, over the next 10 weeks, excluding today. For Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi, the negative traits go back to 10, and hence it's the 10 weeks. So you can imagine a scholar, Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi, born in 1058. If you really envisage or you think about history, the Battle of Hastings took place in 1066. William the Conqueror and Harold on one side. Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi was just born approximately 8 years before that. And whilst they were fighting just on the other side of the English Channel for who's going to rule Britannia or England at that time, the Abbasid Caliphate or the Abbasids inside Baghdad was running a very sophisticated empire. An empire that was probably the greatest at that time. And it was in this empire that Hazrat Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi was born. And he made a massive impact to an extent that he was referred to as Hujjatul Islam, the proof of Islam. He was referred to as the proof of Islam. And he was considered throughout history, he's been considered to be a reviver, mujaddid. Allah's Nabi Kareem sallallahu alayhi wa sallam says in a hadith, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَبْعَثُ لِهَذِي الْأُمَّةِ عَلَى رَأْسِ كُلِّ مِئَةٍ سَنَةٍ مَنْ يُجَدِّدُ لَهَا دِينَهَا. That indeed Allah Almighty shall resurrect or send inside the ummah at the beginning of every 100 years someone who's going to do tajdeed, or who's going to revive the religion. And they say, Imam Suyuti rahmatullah alayhi says that Imam Ghazali was a mujaddid. He was somebody who took on the task of reviving the religion itself. One of the great scholars of the last century, Hazrat Sheikh Abul Hasan al-Nadwi, Ali Mian Sahib rahmatullah alayhi, he mentions in his Tarikh Dawat Azimat, he says that when it comes to Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi, there's two things that he actually achieved. One was he countered the growth of philosophy and the Batini Ismaili fitna that was spread throughout that land at that time. And he countered this single-handedly. And the second thing that he did was he carried out this special project of reforming Islamic society. And that was done through his writing and his magnum opus, his great book, Ihya al-Ulumuddin, the Revival of Islamic Sciences. So Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi, very humble background he came from. His father was a shopkeeper. They say about his father that he wasn't, people think that Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi must have come from a very senior ulama lineage. His father must have been a great alim, his grandfather must have been a great alim, his great-grandfather must have been a great alim. But the kitabs mention, the books of biographies mention that his father wasn't an alim himself, but he was a very humble, simple person. But there's a special quality inside him that he would only eat from the money that he earned through his hands. What he ate himself and what he fed his children was halal, 100% pure halal. In fact, some of the books mention that the word Ghazal, his surname, some people say that it was an area of Tus, which is in northeastern Iran, which was the area that he was born in, and hence his name was Ghazali. Other people say no, the word Ghazali comes from the Arabic word to weave. His father used to weave wool, and he used to earn money from this, and he had a shop, and he used to earn money from this, and he used to feed his children, and he used to feed them halal. He also says about him that he used to go to and fro to the ulama, and he used to do their khidmat, and he used to go to them and ask them to make dua. And he himself, sometimes he would go to an alim who was a mufti, and he'd make dua that, oh Allah, make my son a mufti. Make him a pious alim ba amal. Make him a scholar that has the knowledge, but he also does amal upon his knowledge. And sometimes he used to go to the Sufis, or he used to go to the mashayikh, and he used to listen to their bayans. And again, he used to raise his hands and make dua that, oh Allah, give me a son that's exactly like this. Allah Ta'ala accepted his duas. Allah accepted his duas because the dua of his father for his son is accepted. And he says inside the books that Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi had two sons. One was Muhammad Abu Hamid Imam Ghazali, whose full name was Muhammad bin Muhammad Abu Hamid Muhammad bin Muhammad Al-Ghazali. And his other son was called Ahmad bin Muhammad Al-Ghazali. The second son, Ahmad, he became a faqih, he became a great mufti. And Imam Ghazali himself, he became a great Sufi. He became a great writer and orator. He also became a great alim, but he was renowned for his work on purification of the heart. The father died when he was quite young. They were young boys. But before he died, he'd collected a bit of money, and he went to his father had gone to somebody inside his dus, and he did wasiyat to this person, saying that I leave my sons in your care. I'm about to pass away with this money. Please look after them and also do their tarbiyat and also give them an education. But it was only a small amount of money, so it finished very quickly. So this person, he then took them to a madrasa and he enrolled them at a madrasa, which is where they stayed, and they began studying. And they stayed in this place in Tus, in this madrasa, studying for some time. Thereafter, he went to another town nearby called Jurjan, and he studied there. And he studied there for approximately 5 years. It comes inside the books that after 5 years, he was traveling back to Tus when he was robbed by some bandits. He had a sack with him, with his books inside, and his notes, and his own personal items, and these thieves and bandits took everything. And Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi went behind this person, and he followed them until he met the leader of the bandits, and he said, and he demanded, can I have my stuff back? And there was a conversation that took place, and he said, if you don't want to give me all my stuff back, then give me one thing, give me my notes. For 5 years I spent learning, and I wrote my notes, and you've taken away my knowledge, you've taken away my notes, you've taken away my knowledge. So Allah Almighty inspired this bandit to say something that made Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi think very hard. He said to him, he said, is your knowledge confined to your notes? Is your knowledge confined to your notes? What good are your notes if I take them away? I have your knowledge. And you're only a man worth your salt if you've got the notes. Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi, he began thinking and pondering over this. The bandit returned his notes to him, and he returned back to Tus, and he spent 3 years memorizing everything that he learned. So all his information and knowledge was in his mind. He comes inside the books that thereafter Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi then embarked on a further journey. And he went to a place called Nishapur, which is again in modern day Iran. And he studied there in another madrasa. And he studied there for a long time under an Imam known as Imam Al-Haramain, who was a master of the sciences at that time. He studied under Imam Al-Haramain, and it says about him that he even wrote a book at that time, which his ustad saw. And when his ustad saw it, when his teacher saw it, he said to him, you've buried me alive. You've buried me alive. You could have waited till I passed away, because you've written such a great book that it superseded anything that I've written or anything I've done. So this was Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi, his studies and how he studied. He became very well known at that time. People might have seen the Turkish drama Ertuğrul, and then there's another one that came after that called Osmanli, but there's another one before that, Seljuks. So if you think about the Seljuks, and there's a person there within the Seljuks, there's the main protagonist. Some people say it looks like my brother Hamza for some reason. I'm not sure. But, so you've got the Seljuks. And with the Seljuks, there's another individual that appears inside the drama. I haven't seen it, but I've heard about it. Somebody showed me. A person called Nizamul Mulk At-Tusi, rahmatullah alayh, the Grand Vizier of the Seljuks. So the Abbasid Caliphate was based in Baghdad. The Islamic world at that time, you could say, was split into two. On the one side, you had the Fatimids, who were of a belief that's contrary to our Sunni belief, known as Batiniya. And on the other side, you had the Abbasids. But the Abbasids had become politically weak, so they outsourced the running of the country to a further dynasty. And at that time, the dynasty that they outsourced the running of the country to was known as the Seljuks. The Seljuks spread out. There's different versions of them. There's also Seljuks that were in Anatolia, based in Konya. But these Seljuks that were there in the time of Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi, they were running the entire state on behalf of the Abbasids. And he says about the Seljuks that at that time there was a grand vizier, a grand wazir known as Nizamul Mulk At-Tusi rahmatullah alayhi. He was a great alim. He wrote a book, a very famous book about running of states. You can read it. It's actually quite interesting. So Nizamul Mulk At-Tusi rahmatullah alayhi identified a problem within society at that time. And he identified that people's Aqidah was becoming slightly weak. He identified that people needed to come back to the original teachings. And in order to bring them back to the original teachings of Islam and to do dawah work amongst them, he started establishing a series of madrasas all across the Islamic world, which became known as the Nizami Madrasa, named after himself. So Nizamul Mulk At-Tusi rahmatullah alayhi, on an occasion he was traveling, and wherever he traveled, being a great scholar, all the ulama of that time would come with him, they traveled with him. Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi became very famous. He studied at all these madrasas. He written a book that was well known. He enters the court of Nizamul Mulk At-Tusi rahmatullah alayhi. And like ulama, they like to discuss the fine points of Islam, some points of Aqidah, maybe some points of fiqh. They might like to discuss some issues of history, or some issues on the Quran or the Hadith. And there was a discussion that took place, wherein which Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi's prowess in knowledge superseded everybody else's. He's shown out. Everyone understood that this person is something. He knows his stuff. He's worth the salt he's at. The ground that he walks on, he actually bears witness to this person. And Nizamul Mulk at-Tusi rahmatullah alayh then appoints him and he gives him a job. And he gives him the job of the head lecturer of the Nizamiya Madrasa, which is the biggest seat of learning, the biggest university in the world at that time in Baghdad. So you're talking about the Abbasid state, the biggest city of that time, the biggest university and the head position. Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi is given this position. And he goes there and he begins writing books. He begins writing books. And he says about him that he wrote in total something like 450 books in total. If somebody divided all the books that he wrote, all the pages that he wrote, and they said that throughout his entire life, he only lived 53 years, he probably wrote, if you were to divide the number of pages he wrote, then he wrote 4 A3 size pages each single day throughout his life, if you were to divide it. This is how much he wrote. He became the greatest alim at that time. And it was during this time that he began writing books. Some of the books that he wrote clearly put on his head some of the Aqidah issues that the Batiniya had presented. So you're talking about there's a computer game which we grew up with, Assassin's Creed. So the word assassin comes from the word Hashashiyin, which was a firqa from the Ismaelis that stood up. And there was battles that was taking place between the Abbasids and the Ismailis, and then this group of elite assassins came about who'd go and assassinate some of the leading people from within the Abbasids, within the Seljuks, the ulama, people running government. And it says about them that this was the situation that they were living in. And Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi, he began writing on these topics. He wrote a couple of books, and the people who had this Batini Aqidah, they were completely challenged. People who were vulnerable to that Aqidah, they came back within the fold of Islam. So that was one thing that he wrote about. The second thing that he wrote about was philosophy. So you're talking about the golden age of Islam, when the Greek studies and sciences was being translated into Arabic, and it also penetrated the beliefs of a lot of people. So some of the philosophy of the Greeks started entering the Islamic world and started corrupting the minds. And people thought that philosophy is the be-all and the end-all of everything. So Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi, he wrote 2 books. First of all, he did a summary or a survey of what philosophy actually was. And then thereafter, it became very accepted. People turned towards him. Thereafter, he wrote another book, Tahafutul Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosophers, which completely annihilated the impact that philosophy was having amongst the Muslims at that time. But like every single scholar, in our Tabligh Jamaat, we say that there's 6 points. I think the third one is ilm and dhikr. Yeah, is it the fourth one? Fourth one. Third one. The third one is ilm and dhikr. That you have ilm. And with ilm, you also have dhikr. Some people might think, when I was a kid, we used to go to Jamaat and we used to think, what's ilm and dhikr together? It should be 7 points, not 6 points. But why they're together? They're together because there's a particular reason why they're together. Because the way of our ulama, the way of our deen has always been that with ilm should also come suluk, should also come dhikr, should also come tasawwuf. And Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayh, being a great alim, all of a sudden experiences a spiritual crisis. He experiences a spiritual crisis that shakes him to the core. And he mentions in his biography, Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, he mentions and he captures this moment. He says that, and you've got to realize this is a person who's in the highest position, the highest academic position within the Abbasids, within the Seljuk state at that time. He's an individual who's probably being paid extreme lucrative amounts of money. He has everything with him. He probably has a house, family, everything. But then he goes through a spiritual crisis. He says that for 6 months he's in this situation where he doesn't understand. He's between the shahwat of the dunya. The dunya is in front of him. He has the dunya, but then he's also being pulled by his learning and his Islamic learning for the akhirat. that the akhirat is everlasting. The akhirat is what's going to remain. But the dunya is something that's pulling me as well, and I'm stuck inside this. And for 6 months he remains in this situation. And then he comes to a point. في هذا الشهر جاوز الأمر حد الاختيار إلى اضطرار. He becomes completely forced, istirar, majboor. He's completely, he can't really function himself. That's his situation. And then Allah Almighty, إذ كفل الله على لساني حتى أعتقل عن التدريس. He's not able to speak anymore. Because of the spiritual, the way he's experienced, the thing that he's experiencing, he's unable to speak, he's not able to teach anymore. فكنت أجاهد نفسي أن أدرس يوما واحدا تطيبا لقلوب الناس الذين يترددون إليه. And then one day I began to try and really struggle with myself to just teach for one day, just to make those students of mine who had come to me happy and pleased. فكنت أجاهد نفسي. Then he says, فلا ينطق لساني بكلمة واحدة. But my tongue I couldn't speak a single word. He couldn't speak. So this is a lecturer, the head lecturer, the greatest position, the greatest alim of that time. He's not able to speak anymore because he's going through this spiritual crisis. ولا أستطيع البتة. I'm not able to do this at all. حتى أورثت أقلة اللسان هذه حزنا في القلب. Until he develops a type of knot on his tongue, a metaphorical tongue knot. He's not able to speak at all. And he starts experiencing sorrow in his heart. He becomes really upset. وَقَطَعَ الْأَطِبَّاءُ طَمْعَهُمْ فِي عِلَاجِهِ. And the doctors themselves, they give up hope in curing him, saying it's not something physical, it's something totally different to this. ثُمَّ لَمَّا أَحْسَسْتُ بِعِجْزِهِ. And when I became completely incapable, وَسَكَتَ بِالْكُلِّيَّةِ اخْتِيَارِ. And I became completely unable to do anything myself. التجأت إلى الله تعالى التجاء المضطر الذي لا حيلة له. And then he says that I then turned to Allah Almighty. I begged to Allah Almighty, like the person that's completely under some sort of compulsion, not able to do anything. فَأَجَابَنِ الَّذِي يُجِيبُ الْمُضْطَرِ إِذَا دَعَاهُ. Allah Almighty, He then has responded to him and inspired him. وَسَحَلَ عَلَىٰ قَلْبِ الْإِعْرَاضَ لِلْجَاءِ وَالْمَالِ وَالْأَوْلَادِ وَالْأَصْحَابِ. And then he tells him to turn away from all his possessions, turn away from his family, turn away from his wealth, turn away from his companions. وَأَظْهَرْتُ الْعَزْمَ عَلَى الْخُرُوجِ إِلَى مَكَّةِ. Then what he did was, he went and said he's going for Hajj. He's going to Makkatul Mukarramah. But then he's thinking to himself that I'm going to go to Syria instead. I'm going to go to Damascus. That was the strategy that he used. Because he couldn't just walk off and leave the position he was in. He had to find some sort of strategy to leave. So he says, I'm going for Hajj. And he said that, but he actually headed towards Syria, to Damascus. And the reason why he did this was because the position that he was in, the Khalifa had appointed him. And all his people had really focused on him. They wouldn't accept the fact that he's going to Syria. So he went to Syria. And then he left Baghdad. And then the wealth that he had, he separated, he divided amongst his children, etc. But he left amongst his friends and his companions and the people that needed. But he left a little bit for his children in order to suffice their needs. And he goes to Syria. So Imam Ghazali, rahmatullah alayhi, he goes there. And then he spends his time in solitude. He also goes for Hajj. He spends his time in solitude, in khalwat. He spends his time in dhikr. He spends his time inside the minaret of the Umayyad Masjid in Damascus. And he spends his time there doing ibadah, worship, meditation. 10 years he spends like this. And during this period, he writes a book, Ihya Ulumuddin. Some people say, our ulama, the mashayikh, they say that all our mashayikh throughout history, whenever they finished the madrasa system or the darul system, they would go off to the khanqahs and spend some time with the mashayikh. And the reason why they would go and spend time with the mashayikh was to allow the knowledge that they gained to bear actual fruit. And this has been the system that's always been there for centuries. Although in the last maybe 50, 60 years, it's become slightly weak. It's not as pronounced as it used to be. And you see this in Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi, that he went through the academic rigor of study, but then he went through the crisis. But in order to come back onto track, he went and spent some time with the Sheikh in Damascus. And he wrote lots of books, and the book that he wrote, Ihya Ulumuddin, again, this was the book that he wrote during his time in Damascus. It was all position around rectifying the self, rectifying the heart. And it pulls at heartstrings. Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi, he pulls at heartstrings. He comes out with rhetorical questions. He asks questions. And he does all the bahas, all the topics that he touches on, they're all done methodologically. And he writes his book and he returns back to Baghdad, goes to Nishapur, he comes back to Tus, and he adopts a quiet life. He was asked to come and teach, but he did take up a position for a little while, but he went and spent his rest of his days in Tus. And thereafter, in the year 1111, at the age of only 53, during the time of Fajr, at the end of the night, he spent reading Quran. Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayh. In the morning, he asks for his shroud. He kisses his shroud, he rubs it on himself, and later on, he passes away. When he passes away, they find a poem below his pillow. And it's a long poem, but there's some nice couplets inside there which I'm going to recite. He says, "Tell my crying friends who saw me dead, tell my pained brothers and sisters in Islam, do not assume I'm really dead. By Allah, keep away from saying it is a death. I am a sparrow and this body is my cage, and I flew away from the cage and the body remained. I was like a dead man among you this morning, and I lived for a while and then wore a shroud. I was like a dead man among you this morning, I lived for a while and then wore a shroud. Do not assume that death is permanent, know that it is life and is highly desired. Do not assume death is violence in pain, it's only moving from one house to another. Take what you need and be prepared for the road. If you are smart, do not get busy with anything else. Pray for me to be blessed so you are blessed. We went away knowing that you are next. Pray for me to be blessed so you are blessed. We went away knowing that you are next. Peace be upon you are my last words to you. May Allah save you. What else is there to say?" That was the poem underneath his thing. There's a lot of message inside there. So inshallah, over the next 10 weeks, what we'll be doing is we're going to, his Ihya al-Muddin was then abridged. He in himself, in his life, abridged his Ihya al-Muddin. The entire set is in 9 volumes. If you've got the old Darul Minhaj copy, then it's 9 volumes. But if you've got the new Darul Minhaj copy that Usman Wadi has, then it's actually been compressed into 3 volumes. So he's quite long, 4 volumes, sorry. But if you've got, it's 9 volumes, but it's very long. All the discussions are extremely long. So what Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi then did was, he went and abridged it even further. And he made a short version. And he called the new version Kitabul Arba'in fi Usul al-Din, into one short version. And he divides it into 4 parts. He divides it into 4 parts, very similar to the way that the actual original Ihya is divided into the rubs, into the quarters. So the first part Imam Ghazali discusses Aqidah and beliefs. The second is about Muamalat and dealings and Ibadat and worship. The third part is the evils of the self, those things that destroy a person in his path to Allah Almighty and entry into paradise. And the fourth part is those things that take him towards Jannat, the positive traits. So inshallah what we'll be doing, and then we'll be discussing the third part, which is those things that destroy a person. And he says, Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi, he brings it all back down to 10 key points. 10 key points, hence 11 weeks inshallah. So 10 key points. So what we'll do is every week we'll take one and we'll do a summary of it as best as I can. I'm not very good at it, but I'll try my best. We'll do a summary of each point every week. People will say to me, what's the first point? So, if I was to ask people what's the first point, someone might say it's zina. Some might say it's eating haram. Some might say it's riba, sud, interest. Somebody might say it's something else. But like for example, diabetes. You get diabetes, then, one illness after another illness after another, and it all starts piling up like domino effect. Your eyesight becomes weak. So many things happen. We've seen it to so many people. So likewise, Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi, the first point he brings isn't any of those things, but he brings it back down to eating too much. He brings it back down to gluttony, eating too much. And then he explains how eating too much leads to lots of different illnesses, lots of different spiritual illnesses. So like eating too much physically could bring you back to a situation that you end up with high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, and then all the other things start kicking in one after the other, one after the other. We've seen it. We've seen it with so many people. Allah save us from these illnesses. But one thing kicks in after another. So likewise, Imam Ghazali, he brings it back down to gluttony, eating too much, Jawul Baqar, yani the hunger of the cow, he just keeps eating. We live to eat. All the time, just eating, one thing after another, one thing after another. Breakfast, 11s, lunch, mid-afternoon snack, tea, supper, and bedtime biscuit and hot chocolate. Yeah? So by that time, so many meals. So inshallah, next week, we'll carry on with the first. This was just a preliminary lecture. It'll be more based on exactly what's inside the kitab. So inshallah, I'll see you on Monday next week. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum. शुरू को